Eileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her childhood was a troubled one. She was raised by her grandmother after her father, a child molester and psychopath, hanged himself in prison, and her mother, a drug addict, abandoned her when she was 4 years old. After Wuornos became pregnant at the age of 14, claiming her brother as the father, she gave the baby up for adoption and left home, going on to hitchhike across America, working as a prostitute. Richard Mallory was found on December 13, 1989, near Daytona Beach, Florida, having been shot multiple times. 6 months later, another man was found along a highway in Citrus County, Florida. Before the body could be identified, a third victim was found. By November of 1990, 3 other men were found dead as the result of being shot. Police received an anonymous phone call identifying the killer as being Wuornos, and detectives arrested her in January of 1991. Wuornos confessed to the 6 killings. All, she alleged, were performed in self-defense. After a 2-week trial, Wuornos was found guilty and sentenced to death after being found guilty of the murder of Mallory, whom she stated had raped and assaulted her. She later pleaded guilty to the murders of the 5 other men, receiving additional death sentences for each murder. While on death row, with her sanity in question, Wuornos began to read the Bible and help other women with their appeals. On November 9, 2002, Wuornos was scheduled to die by lethal injection. For her final meal, Wuornos declined the traditional last meal, which she could have had anything she wanted as long as it didn't cost more than $20, which was the state limit at that time. And instead, she asked for a cup of coffee. Wuornos' final words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back, like Independence Day, with Jesus. Like the movie, Big Mother Ship and all, I'll be back." Eileen Wuornos, at that time, was widely considered to be America's first female serial killer. And among other projects, her story was turned into a Hollywood film titled Monster. A documentary on Wuornos' life was also made, titled Eileen, Life and Death of a Serial Killer. When I began doing the research on Eileen Wuornos, and I read that she had been considered America's first female serial killer, I knew, even from my own experiences, that that couldn't be true. In fact, I had written about 2 other female serial killers, which were included in my book, Murder, Mayhem, and Madness. One being Polly Frisch, who killed 3 people, including 2 of her children and her husband. And Lizzie Halliday, who killed 9 people, including her entire family, one at a time. So I decided to look into this phenomena of serial killers. And here's what I found. To be considered a serial killer, one must kill at least 3 people, all within proximity to each other in terms of time. 85% of serial killers are men, and the remaining 15% women. The motive is generally the same from one murder to the next, as is the means by which death is brought about. Most of the women in this documentary that includes 15, mostly from north central New York, living along the Erie Canal in small, isolated rural communities. A majority of these women were dubbed Black Widows, women who murdered multiple husbands, often for profit. Some were called baby farmers, a title given to women accused of murdering infants. Others were known as angels of death, those who kill beneath the guise of providing care to the ill and the infirmed. There were a few titled avengers, women motivated by revenge and greed, and in one extremely rare case, a 14-year-old thrill killer. And finally, those whose sanity is questioned, impelled to kill by delusions and paranoia. I found it interesting to note that the motivations of female serial killers, much more so than men, haven't really changed over the last 100 years. Contrary to men who focus on their victims according to a pre-selected profile and who choose their subjects randomly, women, on the other hand, tend to have a socially intimate relationship with their intended targets: husbands, lovers, family members, and even their own children. When it comes to the two genders, who they kill, how they kill, and why they kill reveals volumes on the basic differences between men and women and their response to how they satisfy quite different needs. DeRuyter, New York, is a rural town located in central New York, approximately 20 miles northeast of Cortland. The village's most celebrated personality is Ezra Cornell, the founder of Western Union and the co-founder of Cornell University. In 1862, following his retirement from Western Union, he received 2 million shares of the company. Cornell provided a generous endowment to the now Cornell Library. That same year, he took advantage of an available grant and established the university, which to this day carries his name. Our first Black Widow would not be as generous. On February 27, 1883, at 3 o'clock in the morning, George Haight was lying asleep in bed when his wife, Ann Jeanette, put a bullet in his head. The shot did not kill him instantly, and instead he managed to linger on a few weeks longer, eventually succumbing to the fatal wound. In a statement George made to the authorities prior to his death, Mr. Haight says he woke to see his wife approaching him with her hand hidden by a cloth from beneath, which she produced a revolver. Then she shot him. He recalled falling from the bed to the floor, where he regained consciousness some time later. He managed to get himself back into the bed and called for the doctor. Ann Jeanette proclaimed her innocence and suggested her husband had tried to commit suicide. She claimed his statement as to her attempt to murder him developed due to an unsound mind as the result of his self-inflicted wound, which he had at one time claimed not to be a bullet wound, but the result of him hitting his head on the bedpost. But the police eventually arrested Mrs. Haight, and following a trial that lasted 2 full weeks, a jury found Ann Jeanette guilty of murder. Following the verdict, Justice Murray, the presiding judge, sentenced her to be hanged by the neck until dead. During the trial, evidence revealed Mr. Haight held an insurance policy worth $25,000, with his wife listed as the beneficiary. Ann Jeanette, as it turned out, profited from similar policies taken out by her first two husbands and her own father, all of whom died of unnatural causes. When her father died, Anjanette relocated to Delphi, New York, and her mother soon joined her. Within 6 weeks of the move, her mother died, again under unexplained circumstances. Anjanette also had 3 children. They, too, all died in young age. After being found guilty of the murder of George and sentenced to death, the then governor of New York State, Grover Cleveland, who would soon become president, granted clemency to Anjanette and commuted her sentence to life, based solely on her advanced age and physical state. George's brother, Jerome, in a statement he issued publicly, admonished the governor, suggesting its content essentially provided old, infirm ladies a license to commit murder. With her death sentence negated, there's no reason to believe Anjanette lived anything less than a long life and died anywhere else but in prison. Her total victims totaled possibly 8, including her parents, 3 children, and 3 husbands. John Humphrey Noyes was a man of the cloth. He established the Oneida community, whose members practiced free love. Our next serial killer also practiced free love and death. In 1838, Caroline Wilsey was born near Utica in Oneida County, New York. She first married a man named James Staley, and in 1861, Mr. Staley became the victim of an unfortunate circumstance, falling from Potter's Bridge to the water below. Rumors circulated he may have been pushed. Mrs. Staley then became Mrs. Henry Way. Mr. Way subsequently disappeared without a trace. Mrs. Way then married Ernest Schroeder. One morning, Mr. Schroeder found his breakfast pork to be especially disagreeable. He died later that evening. Mrs. Schroeder, a.k.a. Mrs. Way and Mrs. Staley, then started a relationship with future husband number 4, Charles Sorgenfrey. Mr. Sorgenfrey died less than 2 months after their wedding. Now, finally alerted to these series of unexplained deaths, a coroner conducted an autopsy on Mr. Sorgenfrey and determined he had been poisoned with arsenic. Police arrested Mrs. Sorgenfrey and charged her with murder and strongly suspected her of murdering her other husbands. She was remanded to the county jail in Utica to stand trial. Unbelievably, there isn't any record of what ultimately happened to her. We can only hope she didn't remarry. Total victims, 4, all husbands. The most famous personality from Chittenango, New York, was L. Frank Baum, author of The Wizard of Oz. A lesser-known personality is one Frances Schroeder and her husband George, a rare case of husband and wife black widows. Frances Schroeder had a great aunt, Mrs. Louisa Pope. Mrs. Pope lived alone on a piece of property she owned in Truxton, New York, located in Cortland County. At one point, Mrs. Pope moved to Chittenango to live with her daughter Frances and her husband George. Mrs. Pope at the time owned $800 in bonds and also held a $1,000 mortgage on her property in Truxton. a tidy sum considering this was in the 19th century. She intended to use the money as a means of supporting herself for the rest of her life, which, as it turned out, would be shorter than she had anticipated. 3 months after moving in with Frances and George, Mrs. Pope became ill and died. Following her great-aunt's passing, many people observed Frances to be in possession of an enormous amount of cash. Frances' father inherited Mrs. Pope's property in Truxton. 2 years later, with the cash bonds running low, George convinced Frances they would be better off with her father no longer in the picture. Her father subsequently died of suspicious circumstances soon after, leaving Frances's mother, Laney, with the mortgage and property. Laney soon died as well, leaving everything to Frances. At the request of the coroner, who thought it odd that all 3 people died suspiciously, all the bodies were handed over to a medical examiner who discovered the presence of arsenic in their stomachs. Frances and George Schroeder were subsequently arrested and charged with the 3 murders. Both were found guilty. For testifying against her husband, Frances received a relatively light prison sentence. George, on the other hand, was hanged. Thus ended the most rare case of husband and wife serial killers. Total known victims, 3. Mazpeth is a town in the borough of Queens, located on Long Island. The Dutch and the English first settled the area in 1642. They called the first settlement Mazpat, loosely meaning a place of bad water. It would become the final resting place of as many as 15 infants, left to die by Catherine and her husband, Charles Claus. When the authorities opened the front door of Margaret and Charles in Mazpet, Long Island in the spring of 1890, described as a simple hut in the woods, they entered to find 2 dead and dying infants. The first, found in an otherwise bare crib and hardly more than a few months old, had been starved to death. The second, somewhat older child, at that moment took the final breath of life. Then, alerted by the unmistakable odor of decay, police dismantled one of the beds to find the decomposing remains of a baby about 2 weeks of age, concealed within the mess of feathers that made up the mattress. A coroner's examination suggested the child had been poisoned with opium, but that suffocation was the final cause of death. He also revealed a strong presence of opium in their system. Following the discovery of the lifeless infants within the Claus house, the authorities suspected more bodies would be found. And towards the back of the home and property, there was a shallow, bog-like pond known as Maurice Woods. Scum covered the surface of the pond, and the water appeared dark and muddy. Relying upon the local fire department, it was arranged to have a pump truck drain the pond. A county official discovered the first body towards the end of the initial day when he spotted a small bundle of cloth sunken into the mire. Quietly, and without calling any attention to himself, he removed the bundle and carried it to a secluded spot. A crowd of locals had gathered, estimated as many as 1,000, and included enterprising peddlers selling lemonade and peanuts out of their carts. Out of the sight of others, he rapidly unwrapped the bundle and discovered the largely decomposed remains of a baby of no more than a month old. 2 more bodies were uncovered before they had completed their work, one of which had been stuffed into an iron kettle and weighed down by a 5-pound rock. The police held the couple in a local jail in Newton and informed them they discovered bodies of the discarded infants. Mrs. Claus was reported to have said, "I put away 15, but let them find them." On October 6, 1890, officers brought the pail from the jail in Long Island City to face charges of manslaughter, among others. To the surprise of those in the community, each received a sentence of 90 days in the county jail. Victims? At least 5, but they boasted of killing 15. Lizzie Halliday was unique among female serial killers. Perhaps more importantly, she was unique even among female serial killers, as she only killed those who loved her. Lizzie arrived in America from Ireland with her parents in 1861. By the 1880s, she had married a man by the name of Charles Hopkins. They would have 1 son together. Charles died soon after from what authorities described as natural causes. One night, the house she and her son were living in caught fire, burning the boy to death. Lizzie was left unscathed. Over the next several years, Lizzie would marry 4 more times. Inexplicably, all of her husbands would die from undetermined causes. Upon the death of her last husband, Lizzie rented an apartment from a Margaret McQuinlan, who lived with her daughter, Sarah. Mother and daughter soon disappeared without a trace. The authorities, now sufficiently suspicious, searched the McQuinlan house, where they discovered blood on a piece of carpet and a bullet beneath a bed. The search then moved to a barn behind the house, and underneath a floorboard, they discovered the bodies of Margaret and Sarah McQuinlan, as well as Lizzie's last husband, Paul Halliday. They also discovered a 4th body, who was later determined to have been a peddler. All the victims have been shot numerous times and their bodies mutilated. Charged with these 4 murders, Lizzie was tried and convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Her sentence of death, however, would be overturned by a judge who determined her to be insane and sentenced her to the Matawan Hospital for the criminally insane. While incarcerated at Matawan, Lizzie was befriended by 2 matrons, one of whom she strangled, and the other she murdered by stabbing her over 200 times in the face with a pair of scissors. On June 28, 1918, after spending 22 years in the Matawan Asylum, Lizzie Halliday, once described as the worst woman on earth, passed away peacefully at the age of 58. Total victims, at least 9. The tale that follows of Roxana Drews is not one of serial killings. Only a single husband perished. But I include it due to its historical significance. Of course, the horrific nature of the crime and the threat that Mrs. Drews posed to her 2 children and nephew add both to the interest of the plot and the cold brutality of the murder. Roxana was born in 1846. Both of her parents died when she was about 10 years of age, and she was left to fend for herself. She found shelter with several local families. She often picked hops at harvest time. During one such harvest, she met her future husband, William Drews. They married in 1863. Drews held a reputation for being shiftless and worthless with a severe temper. But together, they settled in on his farm. The relationship didn't work out well. Roxana suffered both physical and verbal abuse from Drews, and he treated his children in much the same manner. One of the children, Nellie, died at the age of 10. Most people were aware that at one time, Drews choked Roxana until she passed out. Another time, he beat her with a horsewhip, and he slapped and cuffed her around on a daily basis. On the day of the murder, William Drews awakened to start a fire. 4 other family members resided in the house at the time. The first, boy by the name of George, was aged 10 and was the natural son of Roxana and William. The second boy, Frank Gates, was a 13-year-old nephew who resided with the family and slept upstairs. Roxana and her 19-year-old daughter, Mary, slept down in the parlor. After starting the fire, William went to the barn to begin his daily chores. Sometime later, William returned to the house, and he and Roxana started to argue about some grocery bills that had not been paid. She walked away from him and went into the pantry. She came out with an apron beneath which she hid a .22 caliber revolver. Meanwhile, Mary, the young daughter, had secured a length of rope and at a signal from her mother, threw it around the torso and arms of her father. Roxana ran up to him, put the revolver inches from him, and fired. The bullet struck him in the neck. Drews fell from the chair. Unable to make the gun fire a second time, she summoned the 2 boys into the house and handed the revolver to Frank. She ordered him to fire a second shot, saying if he refused, she would shoot him. He complied and fired twice. Both bullets found their mark, but William still survived. Still confined by the rope and incapacitated by the 3 wounds, he lay on the floor. Roxana went for an axe and delivered a single blow to his head. Not yet satisfied, she swung again and again until she managed to fully cut off his head. She then retrieved the head from the floor, wrapped it in her apron, and placed it in a sack of buckwheat. With the help of her daughter and Gates, they proceeded to use the axe and a large kitchen knife to dismember the body. While they worked at their task, they sent the 2 boys to fetch wood. They started roaring fires in both the kitchen stove and the fireplace and set large pots of water to boil. Though it took all day, Roxana and Mary managed to reduce William's remains to ashes. Rumors abounded that parts of the body had been fed to the hogs. They disposed of the ashes in a pond along with the murder weapons. Unbeknownst to Roxana, as she burned the remains of her husband, a thick yellow smoke with an unsettling aroma billowed from the chimneys and attracted the attention of a passerby. The murder came to light when Frank, the nephew, told his father of the event. Officers arrested all 4 suspects, in May of 1885. Williams' remains from the stove in the house and the weapons thrown into the pond were subsequently found. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Roxana's defense lawyer had no choice but to argue self-defense, suggesting that after years of verbal abuse and threats from her husband, and fearing for the safety of her children and herself, she saw no choice but to act first. Given the brutal details of the murder, the jury could not be sympathetic to Roxana's plight. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, they returned a verdict of guilty. The judge sentenced Roxana to hang by the neck until dead. On the day of her reckoning, almost 3 full years following her husband's murder, an armed militia escorted Roxana Drews to the gallows in order to keep the gathering mob from carrying out a lynching of their own. According to witnesses, it wasn't until she was upon the stairs and climbing that her icy demeanor suddenly thawed and she shed tears. By then it was too late. Immediately upon reaching the platform, the executioner placed a hood over her head and followed it with the noose. At that time in the state's history, the preferred gallows did not favor the trap door design and instead relied on a counterweight which would spring the condemned off their feet and upward, where the force of momentum combined with the body's weight would break the neck. In the case of Roxana Drews, the device malfunctioned. Her frame was too small for the mechanism to be effective, and instead, she hung in the air until she finally strangled, her legs kicking and twitching and horrible noises issuing from beneath the hood until death finally came 15 minutes later. She was the first woman to be executed in Herkimer County in the previous 40 years, and due to the incompetence of the procedure, the state of New York would later adopt death by electrocution. As for the children, officials released the 2 boys due to a lack of evidence and the extenuating circumstances. Despite her mother's signed confession that she had acted alone, Mary, however, was committed to the state penitentiary at Syracuse for life. There are those who swear that the ghost of Roxana returned, as she promised, to haunt the jail cell in which she thought herself unjustly held. Moans and murmurs of despair routinely manifest themselves from out of the emptiness and reminiscent of the sounds she made while swinging at the end of her rope.